Chuck Cage had been behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler for most of his life. The hum of the highway, the hiss of air brakes, and the wide-open spaces of the road were more familiar to him than any fixed address. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he had grown used to the urban chaos, dodging rush-hour traffic, the endless sun glinting off car hoods, and the smog that always seemed to blur the skyline. When he wasn't working, Chuck liked to tinker with his classic car, a '72 Chevelle he'd rebuilt from the ground up. That, and the company of his dog, Scout, a wiry mutt with a knack for sniffing out trouble, made up the better part of his world. It was supposed to be a simple detour. Chuck had planned to meet up with some friends at a remote cabin nestled deep in the Appalachian woods, a few days of peace before the Christmas rush on the roads. The cabin was as picturesque as the postcards promised, a rustic wooden structure surrounded by snow-dusted pines, with the kind of stillness that city folk paid good money to experience. The day started off sunny, with crisp air and a faint breeze carrying the promise of a storm far off. Chuck's friends had arrived before him and the group settled in quickly. By late afternoon, they had a fire roaring in the stone hearth and a pot of chili simmering on the stove. Ever Curious had already explored every corner of the cabin, returning to Chuck's side with a wagging tail and a dusting of snow on his nose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in long, creeping shadows, a strange tension seemed to settle over the group. It was subtle at first, a faint unease that no one could quite name. They chalked it up to the isolation or the eerie quiet that came with being so far from civilization. But Chuck, always attuned to his dog's moods, noticed Scout's unusual restlessness. The mutt would growl softly at the windows, his hackles raised, his nose pressed against the glass as if sensing something in the darkness. Around the fire, the group tried to shake off the unease. Someone cracked a joke and the conversation shifted to lighter topics: movies, holiday plans, Chuck's stories from the road. Chuck mentioned a low-budget horror flick he'd seen about a creature stalking hikers in the woods. The thing was never fully shown, he said, poking at the fire with a stick. Just shadows and noises. Sometimes that's scarier than seeing it head-on. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees like a wounded animal, and then came the noise, a sharp, deliberate scratching against the cabin's front door. The group froze. Scout barked, his deep, guttural sound reverberating through the small space. Chuck grabbed a flashlight and moved to the door, signaling for everyone to stay back. He swung it open to reveal nothing. Just the empty clearing, the snow untouched save for the tracks they had left earlier. But Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He scanned the edge of the forest, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a split second, he thought he saw something. Movement among the trees, faster than his eyes could follow. When he turned back to the group, his face betrayed the unease he tried to mask with a shrug. The scratching returned, this time at the back of the cabin. Someone screamed, and the group scrambled to secure the windows and doors. Scout was barking wildly now, his teeth bared at something unseen. Chuck armed himself with a tire iron from his truck's toolkit. Whatever it was testing them, circling the cabin, moving too fast and too deliberately to be a bear or any animal they could name. When the creature finally revealed itself, it was fleeting. A blur of pale, elongated limbs darting past the window, accompanied by an unearthly screech that made their blood run cold. It didn't attack outright, but seemed to revel in their fear, its silhouette lingering just at the edge of the firelight. "We can't stay here," Chuck said, his voice steady but low. "It's toying with us." The group agreed, hastily gathering their belongings. Chuck led the way, Scout sticking close to his side, growling at the dark. They moved quickly and quietly through the woods, following the faint trail they'd driven in on. The forest seemed alive with sounds, the crunch of snow, the rustling of branches, the guttural growls and clicking noises that seemed to follow them. Suddenly, the creature struck. It didn't fully emerge, but lashed out from the shadows, clawing at one of Chuck's friends who screamed and stumbled. Chuck swung the tire iron wildly, forcing the thing back into the darkness. They didn't stop to check the wound, dragging their injured friend along as they sprinted toward the clearing where Chuck's truck was parked. The truck was covered in frost, its engine cold from hours of disuse. Chuck threw open the door, urging everyone inside as he fumbled with the keys. Scout leaped into the passenger seat, barking at the unseen menace that still lingered in the shadows. The engine roared to life, and Chuck gunned it, the tires spinning briefly on the icy ground before catching traction. As they sped down the narrow forest road, the creature gave chase, its pale form barely visible in the truck's rearview mirror. It was fast, inhumanly so, but the truck was faster. They broke through the tree line onto the main road, and the creature stopped its pursuit, disappearing back into the woods with a final bone-chilling screech. Back in the safety of a nearby town, they called for help. Chuck's friend was treated for his wounds, and the group agreed to leave the cabin's mysteries behind. But Chuck knew he'd never forget the creature's eyes, or the way it had watched them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sam Johnson never thought he'd leave the gyms of Poughkeepsie behind for a quiet weekend fishing trip in Maine. But when his friends insisted it would be the perfect way to unwind, he couldn't say no. He had spent years training for fights, the adrenaline of the cage now as familiar to him as the hum of his custom-built computer at home. The woods and waters of Maine, though, were a different world entirely, far removed from the buzzing town where he grew up. Still, the thought of the fresh air, the company of friends, and his loyal dog Rocco by his side was enough to convince him. The group drove deep into the wilderness, where the road narrowed and the cell service vanished. They reached the lake by late afternoon, the water calm and glassy under a cloudy sky. Tall pines surrounded the area, their silhouettes jagged against the fading light. Sam parked the car and Rocco leapt out, sniffing the ground eagerly. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," one of Sam's friends remarked. They set up camp not far from the shore, a fire crackling to life as night crept in. The smell of grilled fish and smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of the woods. Stories flowed easily around the fire, most of them lighthearted and filled with laughter. But as the sky darkened further, someone brought up local legends. "Ever hear of the Dogmen?" one of the guys asked. Sam had read about it once in one of those lurid yellow newspapers he'd picked up for fun during a late-night gas station run. The article described a half-man, half-dog creature said to roam the forests of North America, especially around the Great Lakes and nearby regions. Skeptical, he dismissed it as urban legend at the time. "They say it watches," the storyteller continued. "You won't hear it coming. It just stares, waiting for the right moment." The group laughed nervously, brushing off the tale as nothing more than campfire fodder. Sam's MMA training had taught him to rely on what he could see and feel, not on tall tales. Still, he couldn't ignore the way Rocco seemed unusually alert, his ears perked and his body tense. As the fire burned low, they decided to turn in for the night. The group set up their tents while Sam chose to stay out a bit longer, tossing another log on the fire. Rocco sat beside him, staring into the woods. That's when Sam noticed it. A pair of reflective eyes glinting in the firelight, just beyond the trees. At first, he thought it might be a deer, but the way the eyes held steady, unblinking, sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. "Hey, anyone out there?" he called into the darkness. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves and the faint sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Rocco growled low in his throat, his body rigid. The eyes disappeared, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Sam decided it was time to wake the others. Before he could take a step, a figure moved, something tall and unnaturally fast darting behind a tree. The firelight caught a fleeting glimpse of matted fur and elongated limbs, too large to belong to any animal Sam could name. "Guys!" he shouted. The group stumbled out of their tents, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" "There's something out there," Sam said, his voice firm. No one doubted him, especially after seeing Rocco's unwavering growl. They gathered closer to the fire, their weapons limited to a few hunting knives and the heft of a camping hatchet. The night dragged on, the creature never fully revealing itself. It circled them, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls keeping them on edge. Sam could swear he heard it breathe, a guttural, wet sound that sent a shiver through his entire body. Around midnight, the situation escalated. The creature lunged from the shadows, knocking one of Sam's friends to the ground. Sam reacted on instinct, rushing forward with the knife in hand. He managed to drive the blade into the creature's arm, or what he thought was its arm, before it recoiled, retreating back into the woods with an inhuman snarl. "We have to get out of here," Sam said, helping his injured friend to his feet. The group made a beeline for the car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stumbled over roots and rocks. Rocco barked furiously, running ahead and pausing to look back, as if urging them to hurry. They reached the car just as the creature emerged again, standing at the tree line. It didn't charge this time, but it didn't retreat either. Its glowing eyes locked on them, filled with something that felt uncomfortably like intelligence. Sam threw open the car door, ushering everyone inside. Rocco jumped in last, his tail wagging nervously as Sam started the engine. The headlights illuminated the creature for one horrifying moment. A hulking figure with a wolf-like face and unnaturally long limbs, its breath visible in the cool night air. Sam floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. The creature didn't follow, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that wouldn't lift until they were miles away. They drove straight to the nearest town, where they reported the incident to the local authorities. Predictably, the story was met with skepticism, but Sam knew what he had seen. The Dogman wasn't just a story in some tabloid paper. It was real, and it was out there, watching. Arnold Cavell wasn't sure why he agreed to the hunting trip in the first place. Maybe it was the promise of crisp autumn air or the chance to finally put his tools down and swap the scent of motor oil for pine needles. Back in San Francisco, the hum of the city never stopped, and his days as a mechanic left little room for much else. His one escape was cooking. He loved the way ingredients could be transformed into something entirely new. But out here, in the heart of Wyoming's wilderness, there wasn't much to cook, only game to hunt. The group had set up camp at the edge of a dense forest, where the trees stood tall and bare branches clawed at the sky. The air was calm, cool but not freezing, with a faint smell of damp earth. They'd been there 2 days already, their mornings filled with tracking and their evenings spent around the fire, swapping stories over jerky and coffee. Arnold had heard of the Wendigo before. Growing up, he'd read about it in books and overheard the occasional creepy tale passed around campfires during family trips to Lake Tahoe. A spirit of insatiable hunger, the Wendigo was said to stalk the woods, possessing those who gave in to cannibalism or luring travelers to their doom. But that was folklore, just a story to keep kids from wandering too far. Or so he thought. It was their third day when things started to go wrong. They'd split into pairs, covering more ground in hopes of bringing down something worth the trek. Arnold and his friend Joel headed north, weaving through the thickening woods. It was quiet, too quiet, Arnold realized. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. "Feels weird out here," Joel muttered, adjusting the rifle on his shoulder. Arnold nodded, gripping his own rifle a little tighter. The calmness of the air was suffocating, pressing in on them like a held breath. That's when Arnold saw it, or thought he did. Just ahead, behind a cluster of skeletal trees, something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him freeze. Joel noticed his hesitation. "What is it?" Joel whispered, his voice barely audible. Arnold shook his head. "Not sure. Could be a deer." But he didn't think it was. There had been something wrong with the way it moved. Too smooth, too deliberate. They continued on, but Arnold couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Every so often, he'd catch a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The unease settled deep in his chest, growing heavier with each step. By late afternoon, they returned to camp empty-handed. The rest of the group had fared no better, and their shared disappointment did little to lift the oppressive mood. They sat around the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite. "I swear I saw something out there," Arnold said finally, breaking the silence. Joel nodded. "Same here. Thought it was an animal, but now I'm not so sure." The others dismissed it, blaming the nerves that often came with being deep in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, the tension around the fire became palpable. Routines felt strained, and even the jokes seemed half-hearted. Then, just as the fire's glow began to fade, a scream tore through the woods. It wasn't human. Arnold was sure of that, but it wasn't an animal either. It was high-pitched, shrill, and filled with something that made his stomach churn. Malice. The group grabbed their weapons and stood back to back, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its emaciated frame draped in ashen skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Antlers jutted from its skull-like head, and its eyes burned with an otherworldly light. It didn't move closer, but stood just at the edge of the firelight, watching them with an intensity that felt like knives against their skin. "That can't be real," one of Arnold's friends whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged. Its speed was blinding, and it was on them in seconds. Arnold barely had time to raise his rifle before it struck Joel, claws tearing through him like paper. Blood sprayed across the ground as Joel crumpled, lifeless. "Run!" Arnold shouted, firing a shot that barely grazed the creature. The group scattered, abandoning the fire and fleeing into the woods. Arnold's legs burned as he ran, branches whipping against his face. The creature was behind them, its guttural growls growing louder with each passing second. They regrouped near a rocky outcrop, panting and terrified. "We can't stay here," Arnold said. "It's playing with us." One of them pulled out a phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Desperation set in as the creature's growls drew closer. Arnold thought of his sister back in San Francisco, how she'd always teased him about his love for elaborate recipes. He'd give anything to be back in his tiny apartment, frying up something simple, safe. "We need to reach the road," he said. "It's our only chance." The group moved cautiously, sticking close together and using the cover of the trees to stay hidden. The creature followed, its glowing eyes visible through the branches. By some miracle, they reached the main road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Arnold waved frantically, relief washing over him as the car screeched to a halt. "Help us!" he shouted, piling into the vehicle with the others. The driver didn't ask questions, speeding away as the creature watched from the tree line, its eyes burning like coals.